So as you heard today, we kind of end our year and start a new year this weekend. School is going. Our CU students are showing back up in the next week or so, and football started. So that's a great time to start the year here at Cornerstone. We love that, and it's what happens when you have a football fanatic as one of your pastors. We plan the calendar around that. One of the things we were doing this week is we were just sitting around talking about what a great year it's been. And we talk about the great things, and then those conversations always also kind of morph into how weird church can be at times. And when you have a lot of people together and from different places, a lot of interesting things happen. So we started sharing some of the weirdest Cornerstone stories this week, and I thought I'd share one of them with you. Because if you've been in a church for a while, you just got to know church can get weird, right? It can be great, but it can also get weird. So many years ago, we had a man that was here that was a part of our church, and he was engaging in some not-so-safe behavior. He was scaring some people. We were meeting with him. I had a conversation with him one Sunday morning here at Cornerstone. He made physical contact with me. And in most of the world, that's a bad thing. But when you have an 8 on the Enneagram and a former wrestler, that was like an invitation to me. So it made me smile. But I was told that that's not allowed. So we had to file a restraining order against this person. We just felt like there was no other way. Bad situation. I show up in court. He yells at me. Pastors don't like doing that, okay? A few months later, I'm at a coffee shop nearby, and I go up to the counter to order my coffee, and I hear this voice from behind me say, "There he is, the pastor that hates the vets." And I started thinking to myself, what are the chances that I'm not the only pastor in a coffee shop in Boulder? Now, I'm not smart, but I'm smart enough to know the chances aren't good that there's another pastor in the room. And I turn around, and there he is, this one individual, saying the pastor that hates the vets. And I felt like I needed to justify myself. I thought maybe I should tell the whole packed coffee shop how much I actually love the vets. Or I should engage this person. I turn and I make eye contact with the barista, and this guy is nervous. He's just looking at me like, what are you going to do? And I'm looking at him like, what are you going to do? What was I going to do? I look at him and I do this. I'm like, get my coffee as fast as possible because I'm getting out of here. Well, the angry man starts moving towards me, yelling in the middle of a packed coffee shop. And then the Lord sends a wonderful angel, disguised as a Boulder homeless man, a man that I've never seen before or since. He was sitting between the two of us where we were standing, and he stood up and began to yell back at the man yelling at me, "You can't talk to that guy that way." And they began to scream at each other long enough that I could get my coffee and leave. Not knowing what happened the rest of the day at Cafe Soleil. So sorry for Cafe Soleil. Give them your business because they put up with stuff. But here's the point. Church can be so weird at times. How many of you experience the weirdness of church? Okay, but it's the weirdness of people in Boulder. It's really weird, okay? So it can get like that. But church can also be beautiful and so good. Last month, we baptized 15 high school students and their cook staff in the Pacific Ocean, saying, man, I want to be with Jesus. Even cooler, we got like 100 high school kids. They're ordinary kids. They're trying to live unordinary lives at high school this year. And they have leaders like that you heard today supporting them. We had a group of people last spring go through something we call here at Cornerstone. It's called Healing Care. We offer it every spring. Several months. It's this deep dive to the inner journey to heal. I mean, we talk about this a lot at Cornerstone, but we have these things in our past, emotional wounds. We get nicked. People hurt us. Stuff happens. And what is it? It does is it just creates chaos in our life, and it causes us to sin. It causes us to just live out of our dysfunction, and we're full of fear, and we react to people because we haven't dealt with what's happened. And so it takes a lot of courage, and it takes friends, and it takes community to go through that. And we had a bunch of people do that, and we're just like, yeah, that's Jesus breaking through in people's lives. That's the beauty of church. And in a cold, impersonal world that just says you're as valuable as what you can create, when you come here and you have someone, whether it's in a group or someone that says to our children, you are loved and valued just because God has created you like that, that's a beautiful thing. We have a bunch of elementary school kids, about 200 of them, that care about what happens in a little village, in a little province in Uganda called the Kamuli district. They care that there were orphans that couldn't go to school, so guess what they did for 2 years in a row? They raised money and they ran their little tushes off, and they built schools for kids in Uganda. That's good, and it's beautiful, isn't it? Now, the start of a year is a good time to remind us of vision. And when I like thinking about vision, I don't like coming up with my own stuff, or as a staff team, I like coming up with the things that Jesus says, because he's already given us enough vision in our life, enough mission in our life to keep us busy and pursue us. And so today, we want to start the year with some vision and some of the words of Jesus, and we're going to use the words of a prophet as well that describe what Jesus is describing. You'll see that in a moment. But we're starting a new series called Magnetic, and here's where the idea comes from. It comes from two questions. So first of all, what made Jesus attractive, magnetic to other people? If you read in the Gospels, you'll see that the crowds were constantly around him, with him. And you have poor Jewish peasants. You have rich, powerful people. You have the sick and the hurting. You have very religious people. People from every walk of life were attracted to him. Why? In Isaiah, we're told that there's nothing in his appearance that made him beautiful. So he's not like many of you. Like, this is the best looking service, certainly, of the whole day. So compliment you right now. You're so beautiful, handsome, healthy. We're told Jesus didn't have any of that. But he was attractive. This magnetic force that drew people to himself. So what made Jesus magnetic and attractive? And the second, should we care about being attractive the way he was attractive? And hopefully we'll see here in a moment that mission and the answer to that question gives us a ton of purpose and meaning. So to be as Jesus is. That's a phrase we want you to think about during the season. As Jesus is, so I will be. As Jesus does good, serves, cares for others. As Jesus uses his power, so I will do that for others. As Jesus uses kind words, so I will be for others. A lot of times we wake up in the day and we think there's no point to what's about to happen. But let me tell you something. There are people in your day, which means your day can count, because people count. And you get to be like him. And God will use that. So if you like to follow along with your Bibles, we're in John chapter 7 today as we start this series. I just want us thinking about what Jesus invites us into today, and then we'll get into the specifics in the weeks to come. It'll also be on the screen behind me. Let me just say this. I'm going to read a few verses about living water. We take water for granted because it's cheap to buy. We have it in our homes. In the ancient world, cities ran on water. Crowded cities, they don't have enough water. People die, people get sick. Most of where the Bible was written is an arid, dry, desert climate. Of course, water matters. Living water, think of it as this. It's a spring, a source that you can't see that comes from somewhere that never runs out. There is always life around living water. It's one of those beautiful springs in the desert, okay? So Jesus used this all the time because he was trying to make a point about what he does for people. So let's read some of his words. John chapter 7, verse 37. Here's the context. He is here at the last day of the great Jewish feast of Sukkot, which here at Cornerstone we'll celebrate in a couple of months. Beautiful time to get ready for that time that we get to spend eternity with God when heaven and earth are combined. Now, during this feast, there was this tradition that the priest in the temple would take a container and he would reach in and he would grab water, but not any water, he would grab living water. And he would begin to pour out of that vessel. And what they did is they created these channels and these canals that would run through the city of rock and stone and wood that would allow that water that he was pouring out of the vessel to spread out and to flow through the city. So on this day, the last day when the priest in the temple is literally pouring living water that was flowing through the city, as if to remind people not just about physical thirst, but spiritual thirst and how God meets their needs, Jesus has the guts. And actually, I can't say where he really had to do this, because it took a lot of guts for him to stand up and say this. On the last and greatest day of the festival, he stood and he said in a loud voice, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink." Not in a quiet voice, a loud voice. "Whoever believes in me, as the scriptures have said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." And then there's this mention of the Holy Spirit, which will come to his followers in the future. Verse 39. Now, this is really similar to something Jesus said a while back, a while before this, to a woman who was very thirsty in life. okay? She comes to a well because she has physical thirst, but Jesus knows that her soul is thirsty. And he says to this woman, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Now, let me point out a few things that he's saying here that are helpful for us just to understand our lives and people. First of all, Jesus understood that we are thirsty people. And not just us, everyone. That there are certain things that money cannot buy. That you cannot earn, you cannot win. You can't chase down. Someone else can't give you certain things that your heart and your soul need. There is a longing. Other places he used the picture of being hungry to describe what it is he does for people. There's just something inside of us that causes us to be restless. And life for some people is a constant searching for these things, these core longings, meaning, belonging, value. Always grabbing. Always hoping the next thing will just kind of meet that restlessness inside. By the way, this is where peace comes from. Letting God settle something in your heart. Shalom, wholeness, health, and rest. So Jesus knew that people were thirsty and that they always have been. He's also saying that he uniquely meets that thirst. Jesus today is often misunderstood. People think he's exclusive. He never was. He's never meant to be exclusive, but Jesus did have a message that he is the only one that meets that thirst. Lots of ways to Jesus, but he's the only one that meets that thirst. He's there. I was spending some time in May with a group of Norwegian pastors, and I was surprised to find out that there's a lot of vibrant Christianity and following Jesus taking place in Norway. We've been told that it just doesn't exist in places like Scandinavia. And I was with a pastor, and he said something that's had me thinking for a few months now. I don't know how true it is, but I think it's more true than it's not. He said this. He said, I've never met a person that's ever rejected Jesus. I've just met people who haven't really met him. That's probably more true than it's not. He is extremely attractive. He's stunning to people who thirst. Now, it might take trying all these other things in life before we realize that, boy, I'm thirsty and I can't figure it out on my own before people come to him. But he knew that he uniquely meets that thirst. And here's the other thing. This is the message. This is the whole series. This is how we're starting our year. When you join yourself to Jesus, when you say yes to him, something mysterious happens, a powerful, mysterious way. Your life gets joined with him. The scriptures say that we share in his death and also his resurrection. That's what your baptism represents, by the way. But it means we share in his vision. And as time goes on, we begin to share in his character, and we change, and we begin to share in wanting to build the things that he's building, and that what he burns for, we begin to burn for those things. People, love, justice. And so look what he says. Streams of living water will flow from you. The very thing that people thirst for. Us as thirsty people, if you are with Jesus, guess what happens? The living water flows through us. How is it that a world sees Jesus today? But through his people. So to ask the question, can we be attractive as he's attractive, is actually just saying yes to the original vision and mission that he gave us. To be good as he's good. It's one of the messages coming up. Jesus was kind. He served. He was generous. He cared for the poor. Next week, Jane's going to teach on the goodness of Jesus and how we get to share in that. And we're going to give you a bunch of opportunities that we have here at Cornerstone for you to go out and do good for others. To actually be a servant. To carve out time in your busy schedule to actually show up in someone's life and say, man, I am here for you. As Jesus serves me, I serve you. And then we're going to talk about the power of Jesus. Didn't that make him attractive? People were stuck. You know, power, the way I like to define it, is the ability to bring about meaningful change in the world. Jesus changed people's lives. He got them unstuck. There was healing that took place. His words were powerful. Listen, everything that was available to him is available to us. And so power flowing through us should be an attraction to other people. There's many other things. His vision for the world. Right now we live in a world that's thirsty because there's one vision after another coming at us. And both political visions will leave people thirsty, by the way. But what's happening in this modern world as we move away from faith, we're trying to find new religions. So as politics are becoming, it will leave you thirsty. But his vision of the kingdom of God and shalom won't leave a person thirsty. And then you think about his kind words, gospel words. He told the truth. He spoke blessing to people. That was extremely attractive. So we're going to go through these 5 things that made Jesus beautiful and attractive. As he is for me, for you, so I will be for others. Living water for those that thirst. Now I want to read you another passage that has to do with living water. It's one that a lot of people aren't familiar with. Ezekiel 47. Beautiful vision that God gives the prophet Ezekiel of what could be. So he's speaking about what would come in the future. So this happens years before Jesus ever walked the earth, so many years before we ever walked the earth. And this vision has Jesus in mind, but also, listen, it has you and your family and Cornerstone in mind. That's how biblical prophecy works. There's layers to it, and it matters today. Now, let me read you this one quote from N.T. Wright because he's talking about the temple, and I also want us to understand the temple without explaining it, but there is the physical temple in Jerusalem that was there for many years. It was built. It was torn down. It was built again, torn down. Jesus said that he's the true temple. You look at a temple, you see that that's where God is. If amazing things happen out of that temple, powerful signs, it's proof that God is real. Jesus said he was the temple, and then what he says, we're little temples. So let me just read this about N.T. Wright and mission, then I'll read the vision. So this is what Wright says. He is the true temple, speaking of Jesus, at the very center of Israel. If you wonder what God's doing with the Jewish people, it will center still around Jesus. He's the center of creation, of the entire story of the human race. And he calls to his followers who have no life in themselves, and they come to life with him, with his life inside of them. But it doesn't stop there. They now have to call to the wider world. They have a call to the wider world, the world which needs to know the new life which is already present. The temple in Jerusalem was a signpost to Jesus as the true temple, but Jesus then calls to his followers to become temples themselves, cleansed and made fit for his life to flood through them. And the point of it all is to turn, that we are filled with the Spirit, not for our own sake, but for the sake of Jesus and his mission in the wider world. Okay, so holding that idea that there are layers of temple that God uses and has used, keep that in mind, because you are a temple with Ezekiel 47. It's going to take a sec to read, but let your imagination go places. That's why we get imagery, vision, these dreams to help spur on our imagination to think of what could be. Okay, verse 1. The man brought me back to the entrance to the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple towards the east, for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar, and then he brought me out through the north gate, and he led me around the outside of the outer gate facing east, and the water was trickling from the south side. As the man went eastward with a measuring line in his hand, he measured off 1,000 cubits, and then he led me through the water that was ankle deep. Then he measured off another 1,000 cubits, and he led me through the water that was knee deep. And then he measured off another 1,000 cubits that was now up to my waist. And then he measured off another 1,000 cubits, and it was now a river that I could not cross, because the water had risen and was deep enough to swim in, a river that no one could cross. And he asked me, Son of man, do you see what's happening? The reason he asked him that is it's a peculiar thing that water gets deeper as it leaves the source. But this is what's happening. It's getting deeper. It's a spiritual thing that's taking place, which, by the way, is a picture of God's spirit and goodness flowing through his people. It increases. There's not a certain amount that gets spread out. It's meant to grow. Then he led me back to the bank of the river, and when I arrived there, I saw a great number of trees on the east side of the river, and he said to me, this water flows towards the eastern region and goes down to the Arabah, where it enters the Dead Sea. Now, here's why this vision is beautiful. Jerusalem is in a high point in the city of Israel, or the nation of Israel. And to the southeast, you begin to descend from a high point, and you begin to descend down into this valley where the Dead Sea is. And it's known as the lowest place, or one of the lowest places on earth. And it's arid. And if you have the pleasure of ever going on a tour with Gene, he'll take you there and you'll see this. It's a fun trip. It's amazing. But you'll see that there's this red, brown, rough soil that very little life is coming out of. It's a desert. And then you continue to move southeast away from Jerusalem and you get to the Dead Sea and it just looks like you're on the moon. It's a body of water there that doesn't have a single living thing in it. Completely dead. And God says to Ezekiel, the water flowing from the temple will head right down into that desert and it will change the deadest body of water on earth. When it empties into the sea, the salty water becomes fresh. Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. Large numbers of fish, because the water flows, makes the salt into fresh water. And look what it says. So where the river flows, everything will live. And then if you go down to verse 12, just for sake of time. Trees have fruit on them all the time. And look what that fruit is for. For healing. So, empty, dead, impossible is filled with life and healing. Let me tell you something. When Jesus talked about living water, he was doing what he always did. He was reaching back into the Jewish story that he belonged to, and he's connecting to things that they would have known. Here's some clarity to it. Remember this. This is beautiful. Don't forget this. I would bet money. I can't say I know for a fact. But I like to bet. You know, it's just such a good thing to do. You know, you're responsible. But if I were a betting man, I would bet a lot of money that when Jesus talked about living water, he was reaching back and referring to Ezekiel 47. Flowing from the temple. We get really busy. There's a lot of things to do in life. If you are joined with Jesus, this is your mission. And you don't have to come up with a grand plan. You don't have to be someone that you're not. God is doing a work in your life. Other versions say, out of their innermost being, springs of living water will burst forth. God can help you be like him. You can share his goodness. You can share his power. You can share his words. You can share his vision. You can share his authenticity, that he was a real person that laughed and cried. You can share that. And guess what it does? It draws people to him because he is still attractive to people who are thirsty. Now, one reason this series is important for us right now here at Cornerstone is because we're about 6 months into a 2-year period of time where there's just a lot of focus on our building. We needed to get this old building kind of fixed up and some things improved, and we need some more space, and so we're doing that. And last spring, we brought you the vision of Dream Boulder, where we're trying to make more room so that Cornerstone can have a big impact in Boulder for 20 more years. Now listen, at the end of all of that, we're going to have a bigger, more beautiful building. This room is going to be the most beautiful room in the whole thing. This is an amazing lobby. But because that is not the church, right? That's a tool. That's a room. If the church, us, your life, my life, our lives together aren't more beautiful, then we failed and wasted a ton of money. To be attractive as he is attractive is what God is calling us to. As Jesus is, so I will be for others. Maybe you've noticed, and I want to just talk about some tension that many people feel today, but maybe you've noticed that in the last 2 or 3 decades, and really a lot in the last 10 or 15 years, the world has changed a ton, and to be a Christian is a little harder than it used to be. Have any of you noticed that? So for those of us that are maybe over 30, you've experienced some of that. For those of you who lived in Boulder, you've never experienced it being easy. My little boys, 4 of them, have never experienced a world where there was some advantage to being a Christian. They've never experienced that, but I did. I grew up that. The world changed. And I'm going to describe the change in a moment, but the world went from a world that was Christianized, Christendom, to a post-Christian world, and that's the world we now live in. And it's important for us to understand that, because what a lot of people are doing is they're trying to reach back and make the world that we live in like it used to be. Blind nostalgia, but it doesn't work. And so the question always becomes, how do we make a difference in the world that we now live in? And here's the good news. There are still people thirsty. There's always been people who are thirsty. So if you think of it this way, so I'll nerd out in history for a little bit. I only have a little bit of time, so I won't bore you to sleep, hopefully. But if you think of the way the gospel and Jesus has interacted in history. So before Jesus, you have most of the world that is a very pagan world. And then you have this beautiful light in the middle of that pagan world called Israel that believed in one true God and listening to God's voice and obeying him. What a beautiful message. A God of love. And Jesus enters into that story and says, here I am. I'm that Messiah that you've been waiting for. Turn and follow me. Well, the message is so beautiful that his early disciples believed that this message is meant to go out into all of the world. Well, what was all of that world? It was a pagan world. And a pagan world is just simply defined by many gods. There was a god for this and there was a god for that. Each city in the Roman and Greek world had its own patron god. The sun was a god. There was a god behind everything. So if your house burned down, is because you angered the gods. If you found $1,000, is because you pleased the gods. They just believed that everything, gods were behind everything. And most of the world, for most of history, has lived this way. So even if you come to North America and you run into Native Americans 300 years ago, they had a pagan way of thinking, similar to the Greeks, just different names for the gods. Now, here's what all of those pagan cultures had in common. They believed there were gods behind everything and that there was good and evil in the world. And your job as a person, my job as a person, was to appease the gods. Don't make them angry. And so it could be confusing because this God wanted this and this God wanted this and this sacrifice here and this sacrifice here, and you had to go to this place to please this God. And so everyone was constantly living in fear of the gods. It was the only way people thought, and your job was to appease the gods. So the gospel goes out of Jerusalem, out of Israel, and it enters into these pagan cultures. Think of the good news that would have been on those disciples' lips. God is not far away. He is near. God does not hate you. He loves you. In fact, he's gone out of his way to prove it because he gave up his very son, his own life. He hung on an undeserving cross. He took our death, was buried. 3 days later, his body warmed up. He began to breathe again. You want some encouragement? Just picture what happened in that moment. His first breath. He walks out of the tomb. Says, that new life is now for my people. Imagine the joy in their voices as they share this message. And then they begin to share other things with them. They say, now there's a really beautiful way to live that's more built in justice and caring for the weak. And so that message goes out, and as time goes on, there's a lot of history. Believe it or not, the gospel actually stuck in the East. We're reading a book right now. It's really neat, describing how the gospel made its way all the way to China and India and even the Persian Empire, and there were millions of Jesus followers up to the year about 1100. But in the West, and this is where our history comes from, you get the Catholic Church, you get the Orthodox Church, you get the Protestant Reformation, and our streams all come from that. Well, that world became dominated by Christian culture, and so this enters phase 2. So pre-Christian, where the gospel is unfamiliar, you now get to the age of Christendom, where the gospel is very familiar. People were familiar with the name of Jesus. Now, not everyone followed him. Not everyone said yes to him. It was accessible and familiar. Now, what happened during that time? There were some bad things that took place because I think we're at our best when we don't have the power. So you mix religion and power, you get a bunch of evil things that take place, and some of that happened. But a lot of good happened during that time. So the world changed. And so what we now enjoy with equality and even the movement to lift women and children up, that all started as a Jewish Christian idea that's flowing through the world as people take the message of the gospel. Now, we look back and say they didn't come very far, but what we have to do is compare the world that preceded it. We should be grateful for what they did. We're building on it. Justice. Using your power for good. How about care for the poor? These are Bible ideas that transformed the Western world. Now, during this time, if you were a Christian, you enjoyed kind of some social class. There was some power and there's some privilege to saying that you were a Christian. But if you haven't noticed, we don't live in a Christianized world anymore. We live in a post-Christian world. And so that time has passed. And so rather than looking back on it with nostalgia, thinking that it was the good old days, which, by the way, there aren't any good old days. It's just a day. We now live in a different time. And you're really familiar with this if you're in Boulder County. There's no social privileges to being a Christian. In fact, you're looked down on. We don't have the moral high ground anymore. In fact, people look at us as, morally dangerous. But you ask the same question, what worked in the pre-Christian world, what worked in the Christianized world, what's going to work today? Well, there are people that are still hungry, and there's only one person, and there are people that are still thirsty that can meet that hunger and that can meet that thirst. So although some things change, some things never change. So think about how thirsty our culture is today. So a culture that's now building itself against the past culture, that's part of what it means to be in post-Christian culture. They're building itself an identity against that Christianized culture. And so things are being deconstructed and tore down. Some of that is good. But what it's doing, and we now have people writing about it. We've had it for a while, and they're not even coming from a religious perspective, but they're saying we have a culture that is just lost. The modern world is not enough to meet the thirst inside of people. And so just read the suicide rates, addiction rates, anxiety and depression. Many of us deal with that. We have people that we love and care about. It's a part of our life today. We only have today, and people are still thirsty. Tremendously thirsty. And what we're doing is we're trying to find the thirst in different places. And some of that is good. So, one of the theories is if you just have extreme freedom and autonomy, no one ever tells you how to live your life. You can define everything that matters just by yourself. People are trying that. But guess what's happening? People are ending up with all of these new plagues. I was praying for us this morning with a group of people, and my prayer was this, that when there's anything inside of us that's of need and that is sick, that we would not come to Jesus third or fourth. That's what I do. I'll try everything else and may eventually make my way to him. He continues to be the answer. The power of gospel for the salvation of men and women. First to the Jew, then to the Gentile. Well, you carry something beautiful and special and important inside of you. I'm praying for Cornerstone that we do not get distracted with what our calling is. That we keep going to him for our thirst, and we become a conduit more and more of living water to a thirsty world. Some things change, some things never change. So we're just reminding you of a vision that was given to people many, many years ago. All right, worship team's going to come out. I want to close as hopefully you're thinking about this. Hopefully you're thinking about how you celebrate the life of Jesus. And you're thinking, okay, I want to help. And hopefully it's not so scary and you're thinking, all right, I can be like him. I can do the good that he does. I can use his words. I can share his vision. I think these are things that all of us can do. I want you to listen to every message. If you miss a Sunday, go online and listen to it. This is important for Cornerstone to do together. But we're going to increase in these ways, and I'm going to be praying for us. But as we do this is one of the things that we need to learn to do, is we need to learn to let go of all of the outcomes. God's in charge of that. And one of the things that hangs us up is we just like to produce and change things. We need to learn to trust that when we live like Jesus, God will use it, and it will be enough. Okay? He'll put a bow on it. He'll tie it up. So I want to share a quote. It's actually not a quote. It's a prayer. It's a blessing that my friend Kevin Cologne shared with me last spring that I've just been reading just about every week for the last several months. And I want to read it over you as a blessing today. So let's go to the quiet place of prayer. I want you to bow your heads. Let's kind of drown out distractions. I want you to listen to this prayer. Listen to it as a blessing today. This is a prayer that was written in memory of an archbishop in San Salvador named Oscar Romero. So he was one of those great leaders during this time in El Salvador, a spiritual leader that was a champion of the people, but a champion of Jesus. And he died as a martyr because of the way he lived and who he represented. He took very seriously, as Jesus is for me, I will be for others. And because of that, it cost him his life. And so his friends got together and they wrote this blessing about his life because people were hurting and they were questioning. They're like, there was so much work for him still to do. And what he wanted to accomplish didn't get accomplished. And people were afraid and they thought, will it ever get done? And his friends got together with this beautiful perspective of the kingdom and how God works in our little, meager tasks, our words. And he uses it to change people's lives. This blessing is called a future not your own, not our own. It says it helps now and then to step back and take the long view. The kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, it is beyond our vision. We accomplish in our lifetime only a fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. Nothing we do is complete, which is another way of saying that the kingdom always lies beyond us. No statement says all that could be said. No prayer fully expresses our faith. No confession brings perfection. No pastoral visit brings wholeness. No program accomplishes the church's mission. No set of goals and objectives include everything. This is what we are about, though. We plant the seeds that one day will grow. We water the seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces effects far beyond our capabilities. And here's the promise. We cannot do everything. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing this. But this enables us to do something, and to do it very well. It may be incomplete in its beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and do the rest. You may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are the workers, not the master builders. Ministers, not messiahs. And we are prophets of a future, not our own. So, Father, today I just ask that you would move in a mysterious way. Pray you use my words. Pray you would overcome my words with your spirit to speak to people. There's treasure in jars of clay. May we shine as you do. Humility. A humility that knows that this beauty that is inside of us actually comes from you. We only have it because we're first receiving from you. But may we be like you. Attractive as you are, magnetic to a world that thirsts, may we be like that. And so during this series, Lord, I bless Cornerstone with an increase of all of these things. We are asking for more of you through us. We ask that you would bless our city, bless our schools, bless our families, our businesses. And we know how you'll do that through your people. So make us open for that. Help us burn for you and your kingdom. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.